am officially a part of a particular fandom, and that is the FNAF fandom. As you can see. Also the furry fandom, as you can see.
Yeah, that's too long of an intro, so let's get to it. So I've done various cosplays in the past, and I figured the next obvious step was to make a fursuit. I started by making a head. The main materials I used was EVA foam, some thick cushion foam, some regular craft foam, some light blue fabric, and some dark blue fabric, a hot glue gun, and a bunch of hot glue, some thread, some sewing needles, and some white mesh. And with that, we were good to go. I used this technique that I saw other creators use where they take a ski mask and they take a long strap of elastic and they hot glue it all around the mask. This will allow my head to fit nice and snug, well, not too tight when I put the head on. Then it was on to constructing the base for the head. So I cut out 2 pieces on EVA foam, made sure to measure them, 1-inch thick strips. Once they were all cut, I glued them on all over the ski mask, made sure to extra hot glue them to make sure that they were secure. I used a technique where I would poke a hole in the EVA foam, so when I apply the hot glue would seep into the holes, making the glue even stronger and connecting it more. And because you can't be too cautious, I glued on a thin piece of EVA foam to make sure it wouldn't break at all. Since my Fursona is a bunny, I'm going to need to make a very firm structure to support the ears, so I made sure to add extra EVA foam onto the head. Then I took an X-Acto knife and I carved into EVA foam, and I placed 2 more pieces of EVA foam for the ears, similar to what I did with Spring Bonnie. Once the base structure was made, it was time for the good old foam to be applied. Made sure to measure how much I needed, and I cut it out. And I started with the good old cylinder or bucket head technique, some people call it. And I wrapped the head all over in EVA foam, and I hot glued it all on there. Once I made sure it was all snug on my head, it was time to go back to the ears. I took some bendable wire, and I poked it into the EVA foam, and I glued them along the standing EVA foam pieces. To give it more structure, I hot glued some 2 pieces of EVA foam to make sure the ears wouldn't bend. Now I was back onto the foam. I was making it more round by cutting the pieces into sections and folding them inside. Once it was all round, made sure to circle where my eyes were at so I had good visibility when I would wear the mask. Then was on to sketching the overall design, sketched the eyes, as well as his snout. And I think it looked pretty good. Definitely matched the design I sketched beforehand. And I cut the eyes out. And I made sure to check one more time that I had perfect visibility, of which I did. I then glued on a second layer of craft foam. And I etched the eye design to make sure it lined up. And it looked pretty good. And don't mind me, as I worked on this, I watched our boy Markiplier play through the entire Five Nights at Freddy's series. I then took that thick cushion foam and I cut out a piece for his snout. Once it was cut out, I made sure to shape it using an electric knife and some shears. I believe that this is a vital step to the process since it makes it more natural and less blocky. But be prepared for a lot, and I mean a lot of scrap pieces of which you will have to vacuum. Adding on to the head, I took the cushion foam yet again, and I used my electric knife to cut 2 pieces. These pieces were for his cheeks, of which I wanted to give the appearance of floof. However, my first attempt with making the floof, I added too much detail into it, so I redid it by cutting it all off. And I went with a more simpler approach by adding just 2 simple triangles. After all that mishap, it was on to the fabric. I took the blue fabric and I put it around. I made sure to go slowly and carefully. And I made sure to cut some holes for the ears. A tip I would recommend is to put some polyfill in before you lay down the fabric to soften it up a little bit between the fast changes. When it was all done, it honestly kind of made me think of Sonic a little bit. However, as I moved on to add light blue fabric, specifically to the snout, it turned into the bunny boy I was going for. Then decided to take some light blue fabric and put some detail around the eyes. Then was on to the ears. So I took my electric knife back out again and I cut some cushion foam. Then it was on to the ears, which I made into two sections, this being the bottom of the ears. And then it was time to move on to the top half of the ears, which meant I had to cut even more cushion foam. As you can tell, I used a lot of cushion foam and I had to cut a lot of pieces for it. And at this point, Markiplier had made it to Five Nights at Freddy's 4. I then traced and designed one ear, and then cut out the second one. And I made two pieces in total. And once they were all cut out, it was time to glue both those bad boys on there. And now it kind of looked he was a little droopy, a little sad. So I decided to cheer him up and glue the top ears to the rest of the wire, making him look like the happiest bunny on earth. Or rabbit. Or hare. Or... And I made sure to add some craft foam to the side to cover up the wire. I then took the shears and made sure to cut them, evening them out. I also used a good amount of scrap pieces to fill in any gaps, which left a lot of leftover pieces, which of course the vacuum was needed. Now it was time to switch back to the fabric, so I cut out a rectangle piece, making sure it was the exact length of the ear. And I cut two pieces for both ears. In the middle of that, I decided to use even more polyfill to decrease the wrinkling in the fabric, which definitely made it look a lot better, in my opinion. And I stitched up the ends. The next part was to add the light blue fabric, so I cut out the pattern I wanted. Then it was time to stitch it on. I stitched over some polyfill to make it pop a little bit more. And I stitched the first side, and I stitched the second side. And I know, it's the first time I stitched fabric. It's crazy. Oh wow, I know. After the ears were done, it was time to add on his mullet, or mohawk, whichever one you prefer. I did my best to replicate floof. I made sure not to put in too much detail since I learned from my last mistake. Once the two pieces were cut out, I glued them together. I then cut out a good sized rectangle for the hairpiece. I made sure it fit. I then made sure to take a permanent marker and etch out the particular shape I needed, and I cut two sides for both sides. And then glued on the main layer between the two. And then for the majority of it, I hot glued the big piece on. However, I didn't hot glue the edges, since instead of hot gluing the edges of the fabric together, I wanted to stitch them later on. And once they were all glued on, I hot glued it back onto the head. And it looked good so far. Onto the stitching. As stated earlier, instead of hot gluing the sides, I decided to sew them together. And I know, it's the first time I ever sewed. It's crazy. However, it did take a really long process since it was my first time. But I eventually got through it after 5 hours. After I was done with the mullet, it was time to move on to the nose. Now, I had an idea for the nose to be able to squeak, or like honk, similar to Freddy's nose in Five Nights at Freddy's. And so I needed a squeaker, so I picked up this squeaker toy, and I had to... Now, after the realization of what I had just done, I continued to pull out the stuffing, get that squeaker that we needed. However, some sacrifices had to be made. Nonetheless, I continued on, and I cut the shape of the nose I wanted out of cushion foam, and I hot glued the two pieces together. Not applying too much hot glue since I didn't want the squeaker to melt. As soon as I figured out the shape I wanted, I pulled out some fabric, some different fabric, a bit of a darker blue fabric to switch it up a bit. And I cut a square, a good enough size for the nose itself. And as always, I took the old reliable hot glue gun and I hot glued it all together, making the squeaky nose, added a nice good touch to it. I think it brought it all together. It's not really a very detailed nose, it's more of just a blue orb at this point, but I was happy with it, mainly because it squeaks. Now, my bunny boy wouldn't be complete without a signature buck teeth, so I cut out a simple square of cushion foam, I etched out the design, and like magic, I shaved it down. I used some white fabric this time to make it stand out. I cut the amount of fabric I needed, and just like everything else in this fur head, I glued it on. Taking a break from all the foam and fabric work, it was time to fill in those black eyes. I started by sketching out the shape I wanted on the mesh. I cut the shape out. This mesh isn't as solid as other eyes on fursuits that I've seen, but I think it still did a pretty good job of covering up the eye holes. And his eyes were a bit blank, so I obviously needed some color. So I etched out the design I wanted with white fabric to cover it up. Then I mixed some paint and I painted it on. And after all that paint was dried, I glued on the rest of the fabric, completing the eyes. Okay, that's not right. There, that looks better. So these eyes are not really fixed into the mask. They could actually be slipped on and off through the mask. However, they did look a bit too uncanny. So I added that little sparkle in his eyes, and it made it 10 times better. Now, originally I would have considered it done, but I forgot to add one final step, which is the lining of the inside of the mask. Since wearing a fursuit, it's very hot in there and you get very sweaty, and so I didn't want the mask to be ruined over time, so I cut athletic sweatshirt with the right material that I needed, and I hot glued it all on there, making sure to cover all areas of the foam, and cutting the excess off. And while I was in the middle of that, I decided to add a little bottom to the mouth, just to give it a touch up. Wanted to give it more expression, and I put some athletic fabric over that as well. And you may have noticed that the ski mask is gone because I ripped it out last minute. I know. At that point, it was kind of getting too hot, and it would have been hard to, if I wanted to wash the head in the future, it would be too hard to wash it. So I ended up just ripping it out and replacing it with the athletic wear. And then it was all covered up and called it good. However, I still would need to use a ski mask, although I would be able to wash it since it isn't connected to the head. And after that, I think it was time to call the fursuit head finished.
Alright. And that's a wrap on my first fursuit head.
Looking at the completed product, I'm pretty happy that it didn't turn out to be a trash pile, and it turned out pretty good. I was a bit scared to try sewing for the first time, but it turned out great, and I think I'm going to definitely be sure to use that new skill for future cosplays. So it's always good to try new things, even if you're scared. Another thing I did my best was to not compare my fur head to other artists because this was my first attempt, so it obviously was not going to be a masterpiece. I feel like it's never a good idea to compare yourself to others, but be inspired by them, and to always make sure that you are on your own creative path, and always be sure to add your own creative flair to it because we all have different ideas that are unique and amazing.
So I hope this video inspired you all if you want to make your own first fursuit. I know it was a bit of a long process and a bit of a scary one, but I did it. So I'm sure you guys will be able to do it too. And if you like my stuff I make, then feel free to subscribe to my channel if you want. I would greatly appreciate it. Anyways, hope you all are doing great out there, and always remember to craft and cosplay. Oh, I gotta do the nose boop.